Hi everyone, I'm Allie with Potomac Beads. Joining me in making this Foxy Necklace design, which features a nice Rivoli setting clasp in the front. This necklace, because of that fun, becomes reversible. That you can take the pendant on or off as you want to wear the necklace, more intact, that it's just a nice thing, or you add the pendant on and off the design. If you need any materials, check out the links below to shop with us online at PotomacBeads.com as well as PotomacBeads.eu. Gather up your materials and let's get started. So to begin our Foxy necklace, what we're going to do is we are going to base this on 2 strips of 2 rows of herringbone stitch. These are both going to connect to our Rivoli clasp in the center, and then we just have a cut button and a loop on the other side. I've gone ahead and completed one of them, and this here is right about 7.5 to 8 inches if you want it to be a short necklace. That way it hits kind of right inside as a choker. The drop down then will hang down about 18 inches, up to you how long you want to make it. So to learn the start of the herringbone stitch, what we are going to do to get that nice V section, and if you need a little bit more help with the herringbone stitch, remember I always have introductory videos for this as well. To begin, I have some .006 wildfire beading thread, and I have this on a size 10 needle. You can also use a 12 if you want it to go a little bit quicker. I'm using the stiffer needle. However, you might need to switch to a 12 as you go and attach the clasp as well as our centerpiece. To begin, we're going to begin with a simple ladder stitch for the herringbone. I have on 4 of my 11 seed beads, and you're going to end up using about 10 to 12 feet of thread for this project, so you will need to add more. I don't like to start with more than 5 feet. I feel like that's an unmanageable amount of thread. Going back through then, we're going to start at the stop bead that I added, and you do want to let yourself a good 8 to 10 inches before the stop bead, so that way you can attach the clasp. From here, I'm going back through those first 2 beads, which is going to turn the beads right next to one another. From here, go down through the 2 beads that you just added, and then add 2 more. Go in a circle, coming into the top of those last 2 beads that were added. And that's going to lay a 3rd row right against the first 2 stacks of 2. From here, go up through the last 2 that were added. Add 2 more. Go back through, again, those 2 that were already on there. Pull nice and tight. And what we're actually going to do is we are going to flip this project. So I'm going to go back through the 2 that I just added, so my thread is coming out towards that stop bead. From there, flip the project, and now we're actually going to be working from the end where the stop bead is going out. That's going to be the start of our herringbone stitch. We'll go back then, add a little bit of an extender and a loop after the fact. From here, we're going to start our herringbone. Now I'm using this silver lined gold AB, so I have a nice kind of gentle gold to go along with my pendant. You're going to add 2 beads at a time with herringbone stitch. These are our columns of our herringbone stitch, and we're going to add some rows. I have 2 beads that I'm adding on, and I'm sewing coming out of bead number 1 in this column, and I'm sewing down bead number 2 in that column. Those beads should sit in a nice little V section. From here, you're going to go up through bead number 1 in column number 2. When you come out bead number 1 in column number 2, add 2 more beads and sew down through bead number 2 in column 2. That's going to bring you out right near that stop bead. Flip the project over in your hand so it's easier to work with and that you're always sewing away from yourself. Add 1 15-0 to decorate the side and hide some thread. You're going to sew back up into the bead that you just added, which as we flip now, this is going to become our first column number 1. We're going to sew up bead number 1 in column number 1. We're going to add 2 more beads to add an additional row. Sew down through bead number 2 in column 1. Sew up through bead number 1 in column 2. Again, if you need this a little slower, I do have a couple other videos on that as well. 2 more beads get added because 2 beads always get added for the herringbone stitch. I'm coming out of bead number 1 of my second column of herringbone, and I'm sewing down bead number 2. At this point here, I flip it in my hand to make it more manageable, so I'm going to rotate the piece in my hand, grab a 15-0, and sew up through the last row that you did, the last bead that you just added, which is now going to be bead 1 in column number 1. 2 more beads get added for this row. Sew down bead number 2 in column 1. Sew up through bead number 1 in column 2. You'll notice that it looks like it's separated until you go back and add the next column. It's going to look like 2 separated rows. 2 beads get added on. Sew out to this second bead down. Flip it in your hand. Grab a 15-0 and sew up through bead 1 in our column number 1. As you add a row, again, 2 beads go on. So down through bead number 2 in column number 1, and as you get quick at it, you can also sew up bead number 1 in column number 2. Add 2 more beads. Sew down bead number 2 in column 2. Flip the piece in your hand, and you'll get ready to add your next row. Add a 15-0 to decorate the side and sew up through the last bead that you just added, coming out what is now bead number 1 in column 2. Once you have a couple rows like this, 6 rows or so, you'll really see those columns starting to take shape, that the beads will look like they're sitting on that nice V. In the middle, where they join, the beads are going to look like they're sitting in the opposite row. That's how you achieve that herringbone stitch. You're going to continue this stitch for an additional 7.5 to 8 inches, depending on how long you want your project. When we add the clasp closure, as well as our connection to our center piece, you're going to get about an additional 1/2 inch with those two combined. So keep that in mind as far as your stitch goes. I'm going to go ahead and continue this herringbone for an additional 7 inches, and then I'm going to show you how we go from 2 columns of our herringbone to 1 column, downgrading and then connecting to our center clasp. When you need to add more thread, which you will need to do if you're not starting out with that big long 8 feet or 12 feet of thread for your side, what we're going to do is coming out between one of the rows of herringbone stitch here, you can see I still have just a little bit of thread, so that way I can back stitch into the project. I have another new piece of thread on a needle, and I'm going to take that thread end here, and I'm going to tie it around my existing piece of thread. So I'm literally tying it around it. What that's going to let me do is bring that knot closer and further away from my project. I'm going to pull that new thread knot really tight, force it down into the herringbone stitch, grab the 2 thread ends, the one attached to the needle, as well as the other one here, and I'm going to tie them together. A nice tight pull. And then what we're going to do is take the thread that's currently connected to the needle, and I'm going to back stitch a little bit. We're going to go back through the project and take the thread and needle back towards that start of the project. That's going to pull the knot usually in between a bead. I'm going to sew back through my herringbone stitch, just a couple rows, back down through, and then once I'm down back through those couple rows there, I'm going to take my thread burner or my threads up and get rid of that tail, burning it down flush next to the project. Once it's burned down flush, then I'm going to continue. That needle goes off to the side. My other needle and thread is already connected. I'm going to push that starter thread there from the one that the thread is connected to, just kind of out of the way, and then continue on with my herringbone stitch, adding my 2 beads and then down the side. When you add in between the rows like that, it gives a nice mask that you don't generally see that knot, and especially when you take the thread back through. The tail that's still connected, I'll go through after I'm done this, the next couple rows, and burn that one off as well, when I can kind of pull it one more time and get it into a bead. I'm not pulling it tightly into a bead because I needed to go back through those beads to keep adding the herringbone. Once I'm through then, I pull that tightly down, hoping that it pops inside of a bead, and then we'll burn it off. I'm going to continue on for another 6 inches as I add on to my herringbone stitch. When you get to the end of the design, what you're going to do is instead of adding 2 beads on the last 2 columns, you're going to downgrade and add 1 bead. So instead of adding 2, you're just going to add 1. 1 here, 1 here. From there, we're going to step up, adding one of our 15 O's on the side, and step up through that 1 bead, topping column number 1. From here, go ahead and add 2 more 11O seed beads, and sew through bead number 2, which is going to be the 1 bead sitting on top of column 2. That puts 2 beads in there in order to start our herringbone stitch again. From here, I want you to sew down 1 row of herringbone, so you're sewing down through the 11O below it, making sure the thread stays to the outside there. You're going to sew up through the bead next in that herringbone row. You're going to go through bead number 2 in column number 1, and then step up and go out of bead number 1 that you just added. As you step out bead number 1, grab 1 and 2 beads, sew down through bead number 2. From there, I'm going to turn it in my hand, add one of our gold 15O seed beads, and then step up back through the bead that you just added. That's how you're going to start to get that nice V shape as we go down to add it into our bracelet, into our pendant. I'm going to continue adding on 1, 2, 3 more rows, and then I'll show you how we are going to attach to our actual clasp. After my 5th row here and adding in, it's time to add on to my actual clasp there. And to add on to the actual clasp, what I want to do is add in 1 15O, then 1 11O onto my needle. I'm coming out like I would progress and add another one of my herringbone rows. And instead, after adding my 15 and my 11, I'm going to sew through the other side of the clasp. Now keep in mind, you want to take out that little clip of the clasp. If you have any other pendant that you're attaching to, you would do it in the same variety. I'm not using a wire guard because it gets really tight in there, and that's the only reason. If you do have something that you're using as a pendant and you do have room, go ahead and stick a wire guard on there. From here, I'm going to go back through the 11 and the 15 headed towards the herringbone stitch, go down through the other side of the herringbone. Pull tight to get rid of thread, and now we're going to reinforce this at least 2 more times. So I want at least 3 threads going through there. From here, I'm going to go down through one of my herringbone stitch rows, go and cross over up to the other side. We're just circling around here, going right up the rows, and then go back through the seed beads and through the clasp. After you do your 3rd time through, so your 3rd time through going through all the seed beads, the clasp, and back up, what I want you to do is sew back into the project to get rid of your thread. Keep this thread and this needle attached so that way when we get into adding the clasp, if you need extra, you have it. If you have any extra thread, that's available. I'm going to sew back into my herringbone stitch. You see, back to follow the line along the beads here, along the side. And then when I get to a point where I can, towards the interior of the herringbone stitch, I'm going to go in and I'm going to knot off the thread. So I'm going to sew back into my original herringbone before I did the downgrade, reinforce, and then tie off my thread somewhere along the project. That's going to get me the sides of my project finished, and then I just need to attach the clasp on the other side of the piece. When you get to the end of your project then, and you have to add on the clasp, I've taken the stop bead off and put a needle on the end of my thread. I'm going to go back into my herringbone stitch here, add 1 15O on the side, and sew up through my last bead. Coming out here, I'm going to add 1 bead, just like we did on the other side. So down through my 1st row there of my ladder stitch, sew up through the 1st bead in column 2. It's usually a little tight, but you can wiggle in there. And add 1 bead there as well. When you add the one bead there, just like we did kind of towards the center of the design, you are downgrading. From there, add a 15 on, sew up through that one bead that you just added. You can see right there then I have my 2 beads right at the center of my herringbone stitch, just like I did the other direction. From here, what I'm going to actually do is switch to right angle weave, and I want to add 3 beads onto my thread and needle. So back through the bead your thread is coming out of from the opposite direction to create your first unit of right angle weave. So up through the bead that's on the left hand side of that right angle unit, add 2 more beads. So in towards the interior of the columns through the first bead, that one bead in column 2. So up through the bead that the thread's coming out of, and that joins your 2 rows of your right angle weave. So out through the top of that second column, add 3 more beads. So back through the bead your thread is coming out of. I'm going to flip it in my hand. And you don't have to do this, you can just kind of go right into your clasp. I'm going to sew up through the first bead I added, through the second bead I added, down through the third bead I added, and at the same time through the top of column 2. Add 2 more beads here, and then I'm going to sew down through the bead that's on the left hand side of column 1. Once I'm done these 2 rows of my right angle weave, I'm going to go through and come out to the top. So I'm flipping in my hand, but I'm just getting my thread and needle here to come out towards the top of the design. Once you come out the top of the design, I'm going to sew straight through the top of both of those right angle rows. From there, we're going to go ahead and create then my nice loop for my cup button to sit into. So you can see I have my 2 rows there, and then I've started by adding 3 beads, sewing through my cup button, add a 15, 11, sew back down through and reinforce. Just like we did on the other side then, I sew back through after sewing 2 or 3 times through my clasp section. On this side here, I'll have to add a little bit of thread, but I'm going to string on 32 of my gold beads to make my loop in order for my cup button to sew through. Once I have those 32 beads on, I'm going to sew back through them one more time and then sew back to finish off my thread. At that point, your necklace can be completed. I'm going to go in and glue my pendant into place, and then we're going to have fun working on our drop down from our other side of our clasp. The next thing we're going to do is build our bezel for our Rivoli. I have an 18mm Potomac Crystal Colorshift Sphinx Rivoli, which has a little bit more of that orange color. One of my packets had, or one of my crystals had a little bit more pink. One had the pink and orange. I'm using the pink and orange. And I have on my thread and needle 44 of my 11O seed beads. I'm going to circle this up by sewing back through about 5 of my 11O seed beads. Prior to doing that, I'm just going to tie a simple little knot right over left and then left over right, pulling that into a nice rounded bezel. Once that's pulled into the bezel, again, I'm going to take my needle through about 5 seed beads, and then we're going to start our peyote stitch bezel. We're going to end up doing 4 rows of our 11O seed beads, and if you need help when it comes to creating the bezel, make sure to watch some of the other easy bezel videos. I'm coming out bead what I'm going to call number 1, skip bead number 2, and I'm going to sew into bead number 3. This is the start of my 3rd row of peyote. That first row of 44 beads is going to be 2 rows at once. I have 2, 1. I'm going to skip over bead 4, sew through bead number 5. As you enter this row here and keep going, you're going to end up with 22 new beads on with each row. We're going to finish the 3rd row, and then I'll show you how to step up to add yet 1 more of 22 to get our 4th row. After our 4th row of our 22 beads of our 11 O's, we're going to switch to 2 rows of our 15O seed beads. Once you're done 1 row of your 11O seed beads, you're also going to continue to a 2nd row. As you finish each row, whether or not you're on the 3rd or the 4th like I've just finished, you're always going to step up to continue the next row. You add in your last bead, sew through the first bead that your thread was coming out of, and then step up through the first bead that you added on this last row. So I've done a third row, and then I went ahead and did a fourth row as well. For the fifth row, I'm going to switch over to using 15 seed beads. Sew on one bead and take it through your 11 that's sitting up. Add another 15 seed bead, sew through the next 11 that's sticking up. So I'm going to do 2 rows of 15 seed beads. When I get to the end again, I'll add my last 15 here, go through that first 11 and then step up through that first gold one that I added in this row and do 1 more row. That's going to be the back of our pendant, and then we'll get ready after we're done that to flip over to the front. Remember, again, if you do need a little bit more help in this bezeling, to check out some of our other YouTube videos on simple bezels. Once you get through your second row of your peyote stitch, you can see that I've stuck the crystal into the bezel. And I usually just kind of massage the crystal around so that way it sits in the middle of the bezel, and it'll kind of right itself completely as we go through and add the front. Coming out the last bead after adding the second row of my gold 15 what we're going to do is we are going to downgrade going to the front of the Rivoli. I'm going to sew on an angle through my 11 seed beads to get to the front. When I get to the front, I'm going to do a run row of my 11 or my 15 rather, around my 11 and then we're going to switch the design a little bit. So again, I sew through 4 rows of peyote stitch on an angle so you don't see any extra thread. And now I'm going to go around one more time with my 15 intact the whole way around my Rivoli. Once those are done, we're going to create a little crown and make a nice little picot trim for the front of our bezel. After you add your last 15 coming out the side there, what we're going to do is a little picot crown trim. I want to add 3 more 15 and we're going to sew back through that same 15 seed bead coming out on the opposite side, which is going to round it out and keep those trim right on the top. From here, I want you to go down 1 row of your 11 seed beads, go below, then you're going to come up and go through the 15 that sits above it, go down through the 11 as well, and what we're going to do is we're going to add this picot trim on every other 15. So we're going to go up now and add in the picot trim there. So coming out, so we've skipped one of our 11 that we added. We're coming out to the third one here. We're going to add 3 of our 15s onto our needle. So back around in a circle through that 15 and add that little crown trim. After that crown trim gets added, we're going to sew again down through the 11, up through. So you're just snaking through till you go through and come out the second 15 in line, because we're always going to skip one and go through the next one. You'll end up with a crown kind of looking effect going around, and we're going to add a crystal between each as we progress. So keep going around. You have an even amount of beads that you've been adding, which is 22, so you're going to end up with actually 11 crowns on the piece. These we're going to use as little prongs that are going to hold our beads in place as we continue with the design. So after finishing our little crown prongs here, what we're going to do is add in some of our crystals. I have the 3mm round rose Swarovski crystals, and then I also have 4mm bicones in the fuchsia color. We're going to use those to decorate the outer row in 2 lines. To get to the outer row, we're going to go into that 11 that sits below the 15 after just having done the little crown point. Bend those in towards the project, and you can kind of press as you're doing that. I'm going to sew back through the first row and then the second row of the peyote stitch of the 11 seed beads. I went my thread and needle coming out through that 11 seed bead there and going in from the second row of those. Again, we're going to get ready to add our 3s, and then we'll add our 4s behind them to make it really stand out. So if you decide to hang it down, go bold or go home with this Foxy necklace. So to start adding our first row of crystals, what we're going to do is add a 3mm crystal, and then a 15 onto our thread and needles. From here, again, we're coming out that second row of our peyote stitch in the 11 I'm going to skip over the next bead in that same row of the 11 and and I'm going to go to the third bead of that same row, the 11-0. I'm going to be there right where it's underneath my empty 15-0 seed bead. So that's one way that you can keep track. After you have those 3 beads on your needle, you're going to take it and go on to the next one. Again, 15, crystal, 15. Go back to your next area where you have the single 15-0, and you're going to sew through the 11 that's right underneath. You're going to add these the whole way around the design so you have this nice little rose trim as your starting line. After adding our row of our 3mm crystals, it's time to do our row of 4mm crystals. The 4mm crystals are going to get added at the next row back of our 11-0 peyote stitch. When you're exiting through your last 3mm bead, you want to go back through the peyote 3 beads, so you're coming out through on an angle through 3 beads. So imagine those 4mm aren't there. I added them so I could show you how they're going to stick and sit. And you want your needle and thread coming out then snaking back, so you're coming out the 11-0 seed bead that sits right at the end of that 15-0 of the 3mm bead. Add one 15-0 seed bead, one of your crystals, and these are the fuchsia 4mm, one more 15-0 seed bead, and then back down through that fuchsia crystal. Hold it there near your project so you make sure you get rid of all the extra thread that's showing. Add one more 15, and then unlike the rows where we skipped over one of our 11-0s in that same row, we're going to go right into the next 11-0. And you can see then from the ones that I've already done, plus this one here, they're going to sit with the 15-0s sitting right next to one another, one 15-0 coming out the top, and when you look at them there, they look like little points coming out of the Rivoli. From here, we need to get back over to that 11-0 that's sitting right behind the 15-0 from the crystal. So we're going to sew back one row of our peyote stitch on an angle, so you don't have any additional thread stowing, and then back up to that second row in from the back. Now that I have 3 on, I've got 9 more to go, and I'm going, 8 more to go, and I'm going to keep going around the circle, adding the decoration to the sides of the Rivoli. After you're finished and come back through the last of the seed beads, I've taken my needle and thread down through to the last row of the 11-0s prior to the back of the Rivoli. You can see how fun it is here, sitting right underneath my pendant and really giving it that nice color pop. That's a great addition if I want to put the end in. So I have it sitting right here so that way I can see the actual end of the piece and kind of how it's going to hang down. To make it optional to hang down, one of the other things that I want to happen is that if I want to wear a pendant in another way, I want it to kind of be able to fall to the back of the design so you don't see it at all. To do so, coming out of that same spot of my 11-0 seed beads, we're going to make a connection point. So I have one 15-0, 3 11-0s, and one 15-0 that I'm going to add to my thread and needle, coming out through that 11 that sits along the back. I'm going to grab my clasp, and you want to make sure, number 1 with it, that as you're doing this, you have it sitting backwards. So if you are coming from the back, you want to make sure that you're going into, let me flip my necklace around here, the correct loop of the clasp closure. So I'm coming out that 11-0. I've added one of my 15s, 3 11s, and one 15. I'm going to make sure that my clasp is backwards, and I'm going through that first loop. From here, I'm going to go back down through that same 15, 11, 15. And as I'm coming out of that, I can then take this off so I don't have to work around it. Go back through the 11-0 that your thread is currently coming out of from the opposite direction. So if you're coming out the right of that bead, you're going to go in after adding the beads and go to the left. That's going to make sure that this sits directly over top of that 11-0 seed bead. From here, I'm going to reinforce, doing the exact same thing one more time, going up through the seed beads, through the clasp, and back down through. Afterwards, I'm going to go over 1, and going over 2 beads, So I basically, just as we did when we did the 3mm crystals, I'm going to skip over through the peyote stitch. So I'm coming out through the the third bead there in line. From here, same deal, we're going to go in and add 115, 1, 2, 3 11s, and 1 15-0 crystal. If you don't want to have this to be able to lay along the back and kind of use it as a bail itself, then you can add some crystals to the top. Again, I want to be able to kind of tuck it behind if I want to. Go through the other side of the clasp when coming out there. Go ahead then and go back through the seed beads. And again, when you get to the base of those 15-0 seed beads, you're going to go back through the 11-0 that your thread is currently coming out of, and make sure as you go back through that 11-0 that you're going into the opposite side. So I'm coming out to the right, I'm going to go into the left and back through. Go ahead again one more time and reinforce that piece so that way you have more than one thread going through. I'm going to go back up through the seed beads, back down through this 15-0, and since I have not yet reinforced that, I'm going to go back up through the other side. After that, you're just going to sew your thread into the back here and tie it off to finish up your Foxy necklace. Once you're done here then, you're going to decide if you want it on or off for the day, snapping it into place. You'll hear that nice snap, the pendant hangs down, and the crystals kind of go ahead and cover up the clasp anyway. From here, the last thing I need to do is grab some E6000 or some Loctite, glue my crystal in, and my Foxy necklace is completed. Thanks so much for joining me in making this fun, kind of on and off Foxy necklace design. Remember, if you do need any materials, check out the links below to shop with us online. If you had trouble with any of the stitches in this design, also check out our other YouTube videos, which may be helpful to give you a little bit more attention. Remember also to give a little thumbs up if you like the video and want to see more like this, as well as subscribe if you haven't already to get regular updates from us here at Potomac Beads. Remember, if you do need any supplies, check the links below to shop with us online. In the comments section, please, 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 let some notes, suggestions, and ideas for how you can switch the design up, as well as make it your own and spark the creativity of others. Thanks so much for watching and enjoy your Foxy necklace.